His hands were shaking so violently he couldn't fasten his seatbelt. The plane hadn't even started moving yet, but David Chen was already hyperventilating. 28 years old, successful engineer, and he was about to have a complete breakdown in front of 180 strangers. What he didn't know was that the man walking down the aisle in a crisp uniform was about to change everything about how he saw flying forever. David had been dreading this moment for weeks. The business trip to Chicago was unavoidable. His company's biggest client had specifically requested his presence for the final presentation of their new infrastructure project. As a senior structural engineer at Morrison & Associates, he couldn't delegate this responsibility to anyone else. His expertise in sustainable building design had made him indispensable to the firm, but right now, that success felt more like a curse than a blessing. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent his days designing buildings that reached toward the sky, calculating wind loads and structural integrity for skyscrapers that swayed hundreds of feet above the ground. Yet the thought of being inside an airplane, a marvel of engineering far more sophisticated than any building he'd ever designed, filled him with paralyzing terror. Flight AW312 from Seattle to Chicago was scheduled to depart at 2:45 p.m. David had arrived at the airport 3 hours early, partly due to his compulsive need to be prepared, but mostly because waiting at home had become unbearable. At least at the airport, he could walk around, distract himself with coffee shops and bookstores, pretend that the inevitable moment wasn't approaching with each tick of the terminal clock. He had tried everything to prepare himself. Weeks of research into aviation safety statistics, which showed that flying was statistically safer than driving to the grocery store. Meditation apps that promised to calm his anxiety with guided breathing exercises. Even a consultation with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a therapist who specialized in specific phobias. She had given him an arsenal of coping techniques, progressive muscle relaxation, cognitive behavioral strategies, and a small bottle of prescribed anxiety medication that he carried in his jacket pocket like a talisman. But as he stood in line at gate B7, watching other passengers chat casually about their travel plans, David felt all of his preparation crumbling. His palms were already damp with perspiration, and a familiar tightness was beginning to build in his chest. The rational part of his mind, the engineer who understood physics and probability, kept repeating the safety statistics. The emotional part of his mind, however, was already imagining catastrophic scenarios with vivid, terrifying detail. Flight AW312 to Chicago O'Hare is now beginning boarding for passengers in Group A, announced the gate agent with practiced cheerfulness. David looked down at his boarding pass. Group C. Seat 14A. Window seat. He had specifically requested the aisle, knowing that the sense of being trapped by the window would make his claustrophobia worse. But the travel booking system had other plans, and now he was committed to spending 3.5 hours pressed against the wall of the aircraft, watching the ground disappear beneath him. As Group B was called, David pulled out his phone and opened the meditation app one more time. The soothing voice of the narrator began guiding him through deep breathing exercises, but the words seemed to bounce off his anxiety without penetrating. His heart rate was already elevated, and each announcement from the gate agent made it beat a little faster. Now boarding Group C, came the inevitable call. David joined the line of passengers, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The businessman ahead of him was talking loudly on his phone about quarterly earnings. Behind him, a family with 2 young children was discussing their vacation plans with excitement. Everyone around him seemed so normal, so unconcerned about the fact that they were about to voluntarily enter a pressurized metal tube and hurtle through the atmosphere at 500 miles per hour. The gate agent scanned his boarding pass with a smile. "Have a great flight, Mr. Chen." He managed to nod and mumble a thank you, but his voice sounded strange to his own ears. The jetway stretched ahead of him like a tunnel leading to his execution. Other passengers moved steadily forward, pulling their carry-on luggage with casual efficiency. David's small duffel bag felt impossibly heavy on his shoulder. The threshold of the aircraft loomed ahead. A flight attendant stood at the entrance, greeting passengers with professional warmth. "Welcome aboard," she said to the couple in front of David. "Your seat number?" "24C and 24D," the woman replied. "Straight back, about halfway down the cabin, on your left." Then it was David's turn. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Jennifer, smiled at him expectantly. "Welcome aboard. What's your seat number?" 14A, David managed to say, though his mouth felt dry.
Perfect. That's just a few rows down on your right. Make yourself comfortable. Comfortable. The word would have been funny if David weren't so terrified. He stepped into the aircraft cabin, and immediately the walls seemed to close in around him. The overhead compartments, the narrow aisle, the rows upon rows of seats filled with strangers. Everything felt smaller and more confining than he had imagined. He found row 14 and stopped, looking at the window seat that awaited him. A middle-aged woman was already seated in 14B, the middle seat, reading a magazine with apparent contentment. She looked up as he approached. "Are you 14A?" she asked pleasantly. "Yes," David replied, his voice barely audible. She gathered her things and stood up to let him pass. "Window seat, lucky you. I always prefer the aisle myself." Lucky. David almost laughed at the irony. He squeezed past her and settled into the window seat, immediately feeling the walls of the aircraft pressing in around him. Through the small window, he could see the ground crew working around the plane, loading baggage and making final preparations. The normalcy of their work provided a small measure of comfort. These people did this every day, and they seemed unconcerned about the aircraft's airworthiness. He placed his duffel bag under the seat in front of him and tried to remember Dr. Martinez's advice about grounding techniques. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. It was supposed to anchor him in the present moment and prevent his mind from spiraling into worst-case scenarios. 5 things he could see: the emergency instruction card in the seat pocket, the woman beside him turning pages of her magazine, a businessman across the aisle typing on his laptop, the overhead compartments filled with luggage, the fasten seatbelt sign glowing amber above his head.
3 things he could hear: the steady hum of the aircraft's ventilation system, the murmur of passenger conversations, the occasional announcement from the flight attendants over the intercom. 2 things he could smell: the faint scent of cleaning solution that lingered in the cabin air, and something that might have been coffee from the galley area. 1 thing he could taste: the metallic flavor of adrenaline that had been coating his tongue since he'd left home that morning. The exercise helped, but only marginally. His heart was still racing, and his hands were still trembling as he reached for his seatbelt. The simple task of fastening it became unexpectedly difficult as his fingers fumbled with the metal clasp. The more he struggled with it, the more his anxiety increased. The seatbelt seemed to mock him. If he couldn't handle this basic task, how was he going to handle the next 3.5 hours? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight AW312 with service to Chicago O'Hare, came the announcement from the cockpit. We're currently second in line for departure, so we should be airborne in about 10 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure. 10 minutes. David's breathing became shallower. He tried to use the breathing technique Dr. Martinez had taught him. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, exhale for 6 counts. But his lungs felt like they weren't working properly. Each breath seemed insufficient, as if the cabin air were too thin to sustain him. The woman beside him glanced over with a look of concern. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. David tried to smile and nod, but he could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. "Just a little nervous about flying," he managed to whisper. "Oh, I understand completely," she said with genuine sympathy. "I used to be terrified of flying too. It gets easier with experience, I promise." Her kindness was touching, but David knew this wasn't just normal pre-flight jitters. This was something much more intense, and it was getting worse by the minute. His vision was starting to blur slightly around the edges, and he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape from his chest. The aircraft began to move, backing away from the gate with a gentle push from the tug vehicle. The motion, slight as it was, sent a jolt of panic through David's nervous system. They were moving. There was no going back now. He was committed to this flight, whether his body and mind were ready or not. As the plane began its taxi toward the runway, David closed his eyes and tried to transport himself mentally to anywhere else. His apartment with its familiar furniture and the view of the Seattle skyline. His office with its drafting tables and computer screens filled with architectural plans. The hiking trail near his house where he went to clear his head on weekend mornings. But every bump and turn of the aircraft brought him crashing back to the present reality. He was trapped in a metal tube with 180 strangers, and soon they would all be suspended miles above the earth with nothing but air beneath them. The engines began to spool up for takeoff, their whine increasing in pitch and volume. David's breathing became even more labored. He pressed his back against the seat, gripping the armrests so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The woman beside him was still reading her magazine, seemingly oblivious to his distress, but he could sense that other passengers were beginning to notice. A flight attendant walking through the cabin doing final safety checks paused at his row. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" she asked with professional concern. David tried to respond but found that he couldn't speak. His throat felt constricted, and his breathing was becoming more rapid and shallow. The cabin lights seemed too bright, and the walls appeared to be closing in even further. He was having a full-blown panic attack, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now, and he could feel perspiration soaking through his shirt despite the air conditioning. The rational part of his mind knew that what he was experiencing wasn't physically dangerous. Dr. Martinez had explained that panic attacks, while terrifying, couldn't actually harm him. But the emotional part of his mind was convinced that he was dying, that his heart was going to explode, that he would never see his family or friends again. The flight attendant knelt down beside his seat. "Mr. Chen, I can see you're having some anxiety about the flight. Is this your first time flying?" He managed to shake his head slightly. He had flown before, though not in several years, and never without experiencing significant distress. But this was different. This was worse than anything he had experienced before. His vision was starting to blur slightly around the edges, and he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape from his chest. The flight attendant was still beside him, speaking in calm, reassuring tones, but her words seemed to come from very far away. The cabin noise, conversations, ventilation, engine sounds merged into an overwhelming cacophony that made it even harder to think clearly. And then, through the haze of his panic, he heard a different voice, deeper, more authoritative, but somehow gentler than the clinical reassurance of the flight attendant. "Excuse me, Jennifer, may I speak with this passenger for a moment?" David looked up to see a man in a pilot's uniform standing in the aisle. He was probably in his 50s, with graying hair at his temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His uniform was crisp and professional, with 4 stripes on his shoulders indicating his rank as captain. The flight attendant looked up to him with obvious relief. "Of course, Captain Rodriguez. This is Mr. Chen in 14A. He's experiencing some anxiety about the flight." Captain Rodriguez moved closer, and something about his presence had an immediate calming effect. Not because David's anxiety disappeared, but because there was something in the pilot's demeanor that suggested he had dealt with this situation before and knew exactly what to do. "Mr. Chen, the captain said, settling into the aisle beside David's seat. "I'm Captain Rodriguez. I'll be flying this aircraft today. I understand you're having a difficult time right now." David nodded, still unable to speak, but grateful that someone seemed to understand the severity of what he was experiencing. "I want you to know that what you're feeling right now is completely normal, more common than you might think. And I want you to know that you're in very good hands today." There was something about the way he said it, not the rehearsed reassurance of customer service training, but the genuine confidence of someone who had devoted his career to aviation safety, that began to penetrate David's panic. "I've been flying for 32 years. Military transport, commercial passenger service, cargo operations. I've logged over 20,000 flight hours, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this aircraft is one of the safest places you could possibly be right now." David's breathing was still labored, but he found himself focusing on the captain's words rather than the catastrophic scenarios playing in his mind.
"But I don't want to just tell you that flying is safe," Captain Rodriguez said. "I want to help you understand why it's safe. Would that be helpful?" For the first time since boarding the aircraft, David felt a glimmer of hope that he might actually be able to get through this flight. He nodded slightly. "Good," the captain said with a warm smile. "Then let's start with the basics. Do you mind if I sit down for a few minutes? I think this conversation might be important." The flight attendant looked uncertain. "Captain, we're cleared for takeoff in about 5 minutes." "Then we'll delay takeoff for a few minutes," Captain Rodriguez replied, without hesitation. "Passenger safety includes emotional well-being, not just physical safety. This is important." He gestured to the flight attendant. "Jennifer, could you let the tower know we'll need a few extra minutes before we're ready for departure? And perhaps ask if anyone in first class would be willing to change seats so I can sit next to Mr. Chen during takeoff." The simple act of prioritizing David's well-being over the flight schedule sent a wave of relief through his anxious system. For the first time since entering the aircraft, he felt like a human being rather than just a passenger manifest entry. Within a few minutes, arrangements had been made. A businessman from first class had graciously agreed to take David's window seat, and David found himself in an aisle seat in the front of the cabin, with Captain Rodriguez sitting beside him. The change of scenery, away from the claustrophobic window seat, closer to the front of the aircraft where he could see the exit door, immediately made him feel less trapped. "Better?" asked Captain Rodriguez. "Much better," David managed to say, his first words since boarding the aircraft. "Excellent. Now, before we take off, I want to explain to you exactly what's going to happen during this flight, and why each part of the process is not only safe, but actually designed with multiple backup systems to ensure your safety." David found himself leaning forward slightly, his engineer's mind beginning to engage with the technical information. "Let's start with this aircraft. This is a Boeing 737-800, one of the most tested and reliable aircraft in aviation history. There are over 5,000 of these planes in service worldwide, and they've completed millions of safe flights. The aircraft you're sitting in right now has been inspected by certified mechanics within the last 24 hours, and every critical system has been tested and verified to be operating perfectly." The technical details began to calm David's mind in a way that generic reassurances couldn't. As an engineer, he understood the importance of rigorous testing and quality control systems. "The engines," Captain Rodriguez continued, "are each capable of powering this aircraft independently. If one engine were to fail, which is extremely unlikely, we could fly safely to our destination on the remaining engine. In fact, we could take off safely on one engine if necessary." David's breathing was beginning to normalize. "How often do engine failures actually occur?" he asked. "Excellent question. A complete engine failure occurs roughly once in every 100,000 flight hours.
To put that in perspective, if you flew every day for 68 years, you would statistically have a 50-50 chance of experiencing one engine failure. And even if that happened, it would be an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. The mathematical precision of the safety statistics appealed to David's engineering background. These weren't vague reassurances. These were quantifiable risk assessments. But what about turbulence? What if the aircraft hits severe turbulence and breaks apart? Captain Rodriguez smiled. Another great question. Modern aircraft are tested to withstand forces far greater than anything they'll encounter in normal flight operations. The wings on this aircraft can bend upward over 26 feet before reaching their failure point. During certification testing, they loaded the wings with weights equivalent to more than 5 times the maximum force they'll ever experience in flight. He gestured toward the wings visible through the cabin windows. Those wings have been designed by teams of engineers, people just like you, I imagine, who understand structural loads and safety factors. They've calculated every possible stress scenario and built in multiple margins of safety. David felt his anxiety continuing to recede. The captain was speaking his language, the language of engineering principles, safety factors, and quantifiable risks. This wasn't wishful thinking or blind faith. This was applied science. Now, Captain Rodriguez continued, let's talk about what you're going to experience during takeoff, because I suspect that's what you're most worried about right now. David nodded. The takeoff had always been the worst part for him. The acceleration, the sensation of leaving the ground, the steep climb into the sky. During takeoff, you're going to feel the aircraft accelerate down the runway. The engines will be operating at maximum power, which means they'll be quite loud. That's normal and expected. When we reach approximately 150 miles per hour, I'm going to gently pull back on the controls and the aircraft will lift off the ground. The captain's matter-of-fact description made the process sound routine rather than terrifying.
You'll feel a slight change in the angle of the aircraft as we climb, and your ears might pop slightly as we gain altitude and the cabin pressure adjusts. All of this is completely normal. The aircraft is designed to climb smoothly and efficiently, and within about 10 minutes, we'll be at our cruising altitude where the ride becomes very smooth. How high will we be flying? David asked. Today, we'll be cruising at 37,000 feet. At that altitude, we're above most weather systems, which means a very comfortable flight. The air is thin and stable up there, which provides excellent fuel efficiency and a smooth ride for passengers. David found himself actually becoming curious about the flight, rather than purely terrified. How does the aircraft maintain cabin pressure at that altitude? Excellent technical question, Captain Rodriguez replied with obvious approval. The aircraft has multiple pressurization systems that maintain a cabin environment equivalent to about 8,000 feet elevation, similar to Denver, Colorado. The pressure is continuously monitored and adjusted automatically, with multiple backup systems in case of any malfunction. They spent several more minutes discussing the technical aspects of flight operations. Captain Rodriguez explained the navigation systems, the air traffic control network, the weather detection equipment, and the extensive training requirements for flight crews. With each explanation, David felt his understanding increase and his anxiety decrease. "Mr. Chen," the captain said finally, "I want to ask you something. What do you do for work?" "I'm a structural engineer. I design buildings, mostly commercial and residential high-rises." "Perfect," Captain Rodriguez said with a smile. "Then you understand better than most passengers the principles of structural engineering, safety factors, and risk management. You know that a well-designed structure isn't held together by luck or wishful thinking, but by careful calculation and robust engineering." David nodded. "This aircraft is no different. Every component has been designed, tested, and certified by engineers who understand the same principles you use in your work every day. The difference is that aircraft engineering has even higher safety standards than building construction, because we don't have the luxury of being able to pull over and fix things if something goes wrong." The comparison to his own professional expertise was exactly what David needed to hear.
He understood building codes, safety inspections, and redundant systems. Applying that same framework to aviation made the entire concept of flight seem less like blind faith and more like applied engineering. "Are you ready to experience some of that engineering in action?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "I think I am."
Outstanding. I'm going to return to the cockpit now to begin our takeoff procedures, but I want you to remember everything we've talked about during the next few minutes. When you feel the engine spool up, think about the redundant systems and safety margins. When you feel the aircraft lift off, think about the aerodynamic principles that make flight not just possible, but routine and predictable. Captain Rodriguez stood up and extended his hand. "It's been a pleasure talking with you, Mr. Chen. I have a feeling this is going to be a much better flight than you anticipated." David shook the captain's hand, surprised by how much his perspective had changed in just 20 minutes of conversation. "Thank you, Captain Rodriguez. I can't tell you how much this has helped." "That's what we're here for," the captain replied. "Safe flight, comfortable passengers, and getting everyone to their destination feeling good about the experience." As Captain Rodriguez walked back toward the cockpit, David settled into his aisle seat and looked around the cabin with new eyes. The other passengers no longer seemed like fellow victims of a dangerous endeavor, but rather like customers of a well-engineered transportation system. The flight attendants weren't just service personnel, but trained safety professionals who knew exactly how to handle any situation that might arise. The aircraft began to move toward the runway, but this time David felt the motion with curiosity rather than panic. He could feel the precision of the steering systems, the smooth operation of the landing gear, the careful coordination between the pilot and ground control. Instead of feeling trapped, he felt like he was experiencing a remarkable feat of human engineering and coordination. As they lined up for takeoff, David heard Captain Rodriguez's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been cleared for takeoff, and we anticipate a smooth flight to Chicago today. Flight time will be approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes, and we'll be cruising at 37,000 feet where the weather looks excellent. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight."
David smiled at the words, "sit back and relax." 20 minutes ago, they would have seemed like a cruel joke. Now they sounded like genuine possibilities. The engines began to spool up, and David listened to them with the appreciation of an engineer rather than the terror of a victim. He could hear the precision of their operation, the steady buildup of power, the careful modulation as Captain Rodriguez managed the throttles. The aircraft began to accelerate down the runway, and David felt himself pressed gently back into his seat by the forces of acceleration. Instead of fighting the sensation, he allowed himself to experience it as evidence of the engine's remarkable power and efficiency. At exactly the moment Captain Rodriguez had predicted, the aircraft lifted smoothly off the ground. David felt the subtle change in dynamics as they transitioned from ground operations to flight operations, and he found himself marveling at the elegance of the engineering rather than fearing the separation from Earth. As they climbed toward cruising altitude, David looked out the window at the city of Seattle growing smaller below them. For the first time in his adult life, he was experiencing flight not as an ordeal to be endured, but as an achievement to be appreciated. The conversation with Captain Rodriguez hadn't just calmed his immediate anxiety, it had fundamentally changed his relationship with aviation. He was still nervous, but it was the manageable nervousness of someone trying something challenging, rather than the overwhelming terror of someone facing certain doom. And as the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude and the ride became as smooth as Captain Rodriguez had promised, David Chen realized that he was actually enjoying his first comfortable flight. The man in the pilot uniform had indeed changed everything about how he saw flying. But more than that, he had shown David that sometimes the difference between terror and wonder is simply a matter of understanding.
20 minutes into the flight, as the aircraft settled into smooth cruising flight at 37,000 feet, David found himself in a situation he had never imagined possible. He was actually relaxed on an airplane. The gentle hum of the engines, which had seemed ominous during boarding, now sounded reassuring, evidence of the mechanical precision that Captain Rodriguez had described. The transformation was remarkable, but David knew it wasn't complete. While his immediate panic had subsided, he could still feel an undercurrent of anxiety, like a river flowing beneath ice. He understood intellectually that he was safe, but his emotional responses were taking longer to catch up with his rational mind. Jennifer, the flight attendant who had first noticed his distress, stopped by his seat during her routine cabin check. "How are you feeling now, Mr. Chen?" she asked with genuine concern. "Much better, thank you." And he meant it. "Captain Rodriguez really helped me understand what was happening." She smiled. "He's wonderful with nervous passengers. He has a way of making everyone feel like they understand flying, not just endure it." After she moved on, David found himself reflecting on what had just happened. In his professional life, he was accustomed to being the expert, the person others turned to for technical knowledge and reassurance. Being in a situation where he felt completely helpless and dependent on others' expertise was humbling, but also oddly liberating. His phone buzzed with a text message from his colleague, Mike. "Hope your flight goes well. Looking forward to hearing how the Chicago presentation goes." David realized that for the first time since boarding, he was actually thinking about the purpose of his trip rather than just surviving the journey. About 40 minutes into the flight, David was surprised to see Captain Rodriguez walking down the aisle toward him. The captain had changed out of his uniform jacket and rolled up his sleeves, giving him a more casual, approachable appearance. "Mind if I join you for a few minutes?" the captain asked, gesturing to the empty middle seat. "My co-pilot is perfectly capable of handling things for a while, and I wanted to check on how you're doing." David was touched by the personal attention. "Please, sit down. I'm doing much better, thanks to you." Captain Rodriguez settled into the seat beside him. "I'm glad to hear that. But I wanted to talk with you about something more than just the technical aspects of this flight. If you're comfortable sharing, I'd like to understand what makes flying so frightening for you." David considered the question. It wasn't something he had ever really analyzed deeply, even during his sessions with Dr. Martinez. "I think it's the lack of control," he said slowly. "In my work, I can calculate every load, verify every connection, inspect every detail. But in an airplane, I have to trust systems I can't see and people I don't know. That's a very common fear, and it's not irrational. You're absolutely right that you don't have control over the aircraft or its systems. But let me ask you something. Do you drive a car?" "Every day." "When you're driving on the highway at 70 miles per hour, do you have control over the other drivers around you? Do you know whether the person in the next lane is drunk or distracted or having a medical emergency?" David paused, considering the comparison. "No, I suppose I don't." "Yet you're comfortable driving, even though statistically it's far more dangerous than flying. Why do you think that is?" David thought about it. "I guess because I'm familiar with driving. I understand how cars work, I know the roads. I feel like I can react to situations as they develop." Exactly. Fear often has less to do with actual risk and more to do with familiarity and perceived control. You've been driving for years, so it feels normal and manageable. Flying is unfamiliar, so it feels dangerous, even though the statistics tell us the opposite is true. The insight resonated with David. As an engineer, he dealt with unfamiliar technical challenges all the time, but he approached them systematically, learning the principles and building understanding through experience. He had never applied that same approach to his fear of flying. "Can I tell you something about my own experience with fear?" Captain Rodriguez asked. David nodded, curious to hear how someone who seemed so confident and in control dealt with anxiety. "When I first started flying, I wasn't afraid of the aircraft or the technical aspects of flight. I was terrified of making a mistake that would hurt people. Every time I sat in the captain's seat, I felt the weight of responsibility for every passenger on the plane." Captain Rodriguez gazed out the window at the landscape passing far below. "I remember one flight early in my career. I was probably about your age, when we encountered some unexpected turbulence. Nothing dangerous, just rough air that made for an uncomfortable ride. but I could hear passengers crying, and I knew they were frightened, and I felt like I had failed them somehow. How did you get past that feeling? David asked. Experience partly, but more importantly, I learned to reframe what my responsibility actually was. My job isn't to control the weather or eliminate every bump and discomfort. My job is to operate the aircraft safely and professionally, to make good decisions based on the information available to me, and to communicate clearly with passengers and crew.
David found himself thinking about his own professional challenges. That's actually similar to structural engineering. I can't control earthquake for hurricanes, but I can design buildings that will withstand them safely. Exactly. We both work in fields where we manage risk rather than eliminate it entirely. The difference is that you're used to being the expert in control, and today you're the passenger who has to trust someone else's expertise. The conversation was helping David understand not just his fear of flying, but his relationship with control and trust more generally. As someone who had built his career on technical competence and careful analysis, being in a situation where he had to rely entirely on other skills was fundamentally uncomfortable. "Captain Rodriguez," David said, "can I ask you about something specific? What would happen if both engines failed during flight?" It was the scenario that had haunted David's imagination for years, the possibility of complete power loss while airborne. "Another excellent engineering question," the captain replied. "First, let me emphasize that the scenario you're describing is extraordinarily unlikely. Modern jet engines are incredibly reliable, and having both engines fail simultaneously would require a very specific and rare set of circumstances. But if it did happen? If both engines failed, we wouldn't just fall out of the sky. This aircraft becomes a very capable glider. At our current altitude and speed, we could glide for approximately 130 miles before needing to land. That gives us time to run through emergency procedures, communicate with air traffic control, and find a suitable airport for landing." Captain Rodriguez pulled out his phone and showed David a diagram. In fact, there have been several famous cases where aircraft have landed safely after complete engine failure. The most well-known is probably U.S. Airways Flight 1549, which lost both engines after striking birds and successfully landed on the Hudson River. All 155 people aboard survived. I remember that story, but wasn't that an exceptional situation with an exceptional pilot? Captain Sullenberger was indeed an experienced and skilled pilot, but what he did wasn't superhuman. It was the result of extensive training, good procedures, and aircraft systems designed to handle emergency situations. Every airline pilot trains regularly for these scenarios, even though we hope we'll never have to use that training. The discussion was helping David understand that even worst-case scenarios had been anticipated and planned for. It wasn't just blind luck that kept aircraft safe, it was systematic preparation for every conceivable situation. "Can I share something with you that might seem unrelated?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "Of course. I have a son who's about your age. He's a software engineer, very analytical mind, similar to yours in some ways. A few years ago, he was diagnosed with a serious medical condition that required surgery. He spent weeks researching the procedure, reading medical journals, consulting with multiple specialists." David listened intently, wondering where the story was leading. "The day before his surgery, he called me in a panic. Despite all his research, he felt like he was putting his life in the hands of strangers, and he couldn't control what would happen once they put him under anesthesia." "That sounds familiar," David said with a wry smile. "I told him something that I think might apply to your situation too. I said that his fear was understandable and even rational, but that he was focusing on the wrong question. The question wasn't whether he could control what happened during surgery. The question was whether the people performing the surgery were competent, experienced, and committed to his well-being. Captain Rodriguez turned to face David directly. You can't control this aircraft or make decisions about our flight path or engine management. But you can evaluate whether the people responsible for those things are qualified to handle them safely. And how would I do that evaluation? David asked. Well, let's start with me. I've been flying commercially for 15 years, and I've accumulated over 12,000 hours of flight time on this specific aircraft type. I'm required to undergo simulator training every 6 months, where I practice handling emergencies that I hope I'll never have to use in real life. I have to pass medical examinations, proficiency checks, and recurrent training to maintain my license. Captain Rodriguez continued, My co-pilot today, First Officer Williams, has 8 years of commercial flying experience and over 5,000 hours on this aircraft type. Our flight attendants are trained in medical emergency response, evacuation procedures, and safety equipment operation. Air traffic control is monitoring our progress and communicating with us throughout the flight. The systematic description of qualifications and oversight was exactly the kind of information David's engineer mind needed to evaluate risk rationally. But here's what might be most relevant to your specific concerns, Captain Rodriguez added. This airline has been operating for 43 years without a single fatality. Not just a good safety record, a perfect safety record. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because of systematic attention to maintenance, training, procedures, and safety culture. David felt another layer of anxiety dissolving. I hadn't thought to research the airline's safety record before booking. Most passengers don't, and that's perfectly normal. But since you're someone who appreciates data and systematic analysis, it might be worth knowing that the airline industry as a whole has seen dramatic improvements in safety over the past few decades. What we're doing today, routine commercial aviation, is the result of decades of continuous improvement in training, technology, and procedures. A flight attendant approached with the beverage cart, and Captain Rodriguez ordered a coffee. Can I get you anything, Mr. Chen? David realized that for the first time since boarding, he actually felt thirsty rather than nauseous. I'll have some water, please. As they waited for their drinks, Captain Rodriguez asked, What kind of engineering projects do you work on? You mentioned structural engineering earlier. David found himself relaxing into a normal conversation about his work. Mostly commercial buildings, some residential high-rises. My specialty is sustainable design, incorporating renewable energy systems and environmental efficient materials into structural plans. That must be challenging, balancing sustainability with structural requirements and cost considerations. It is, but it's also what makes the work interesting. Every project requires finding optimal solutions within multiple constraints. David paused, struck by a realization. That's actually very similar to what you do, isn't it? Managing multiple variables and constraints to achieve safe, efficient flight operations?
That's a great analogy. Every flight involves balancing weather conditions, fuel efficiency, air traffic requirements, passenger comfort, and safety margins. No two flights are exactly the same, but the fundamental principles and decision-making processes are consistent. Their drinks arrived, and David took a sip of water, noticing that his hand was completely steady. The transformation from his earlier state seemed almost miraculous. Captain Rodriguez, can I ask you something personal? David said. Do you ever get nervous about flying? The captain considered the question thoughtfully. I get concerned about specific situations, severe weather, mechanical issues, air traffic delays that might affect fuel planning, but I don't get nervous about flying itself, because I understand the systems and procedures so well. Have you ever had to handle a serious emergency?
A few times over the years, never anything catastrophic, but situations that required careful decision-making and coordination with crew and air traffic control. Each time, the training and procedures worked exactly as they were designed to. Captain Rodriguez sipped his coffee. But you know what I think is interesting about your situation? You're approaching your fear exactly the way a good engineer should. You're asking the right questions, seeking to understand the underlying principles, looking for data and systematic analysis rather than just hoping for reassurance. The compliment meant more to David than generic statements about flying being safe. It validated his approach to understanding and managing risk. "I have a proposal for you," Captain Rodriguez said. "When we land in Chicago, would you be interested in seeing the cockpit? I could show you some of the systems we've been discussing and answer any additional questions you might have." David's first instinct was to politely decline. He wanted to get off the aircraft as quickly as possible once they landed. But then he realized that avoiding the opportunity would be letting his old fears win, despite everything he had learned during the flight. "I would like that very much," he said. "Excellent. And I have another suggestion, if you're open to it. There are some excellent books about aviation safety and aircraft systems that might interest someone with your technical background. Understanding more about how all of this works might make future flights even more comfortable for you." The idea of approaching flying as a subject to study and understand, rather than an ordeal to endure, appealed to David's systematic nature. They talked for another 20 minutes, covering topics ranging from aviation weather systems to air traffic control procedures. David found himself asking increasingly sophisticated questions, and Captain Rodriguez seemed genuinely pleased to discuss the technical aspects of flight operations with someone who could appreciate the engineering involved. Eventually, Captain Rodriguez checked his watch. "I should get back to the cockpit. We'll be starting our descent into Chicago in about 30 minutes. "Thank you," David said, and he meant it more than he could express. "This has been transformative. I'm very glad I could help. And Mr. Chen, I have a feeling your presentation in Chicago is going to go very well. Someone who can change his perspective on flying this dramatically in a single flight obviously has the intellectual flexibility and courage to handle whatever professional challenges come his way." As Captain Rodriguez returned to the cockpit, David settled back in his seat with a sense of accomplishment he had never expected to feel on an airplane. He looked out the window at the landscape of the American Midwest passing beneath them, and for the first time in his adult life, he found the view from 37,000 feet beautiful rather than terrifying. The remainder of the flight passed smoothly. David even dozed for a while, something he would have thought impossible just a few hours earlier. When the announcement came that they were beginning their descent into Chicago, he felt a mixture of anticipation about his upcoming presentation and genuine disappointment that the flight was ending. During the descent, David paid attention to each sensation: the change in engine sounds as the pilots reduced power, the gentle turns as they followed air traffic control vectors, the extension of the landing gear with its mechanical sounds and vibrations. Instead of interpreting these as signs of potential problems, he understood them as evidence of normal, well-designed procedures being executed professionally. The landing was smooth and routine, exactly as Captain Rodriguez had predicted. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, David felt a profound sense of gratitude for the crew who had not only transported him safely from Seattle to Chicago, but had fundamentally changed his relationship with aviation. True to his word, Captain Rodriguez invited David to visit the cockpit after the other passengers had deplaned. Standing behind the pilot seats, looking at the array of instruments and controls, David marveled at the sophistication of the systems and the obvious competence required to operate them safely. "This is remarkable," David said, examining the flight management computer and navigation displays. "The amount of redundancy and automation is impressive. Every critical system has multiple backups, and everything is designed with human factors in mind: how to present information clearly to pilots, and how to make the right decisions obvious even under stress." David spent 20 minutes in the cockpit, asking questions and gaining deeper appreciation for the complexity and elegance of modern aviation systems. When he finally left the aircraft, he shook hands with Captain Rodriguez and the entire flight crew. "Thank you for giving me back something I didn't know I had lost," David told the captain. "What's that?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "The ability to trust other people's expertise as much as I trust my own." As David walked through Chicago O'Hare Airport toward the ground transportation area, he found himself looking forward to his return flight to Seattle. For the first time in years, air travel seemed like an opportunity rather than an ordeal. His phone buzzed with another message from his colleague Mike. "How was the flight?" David smiled as he typed his response, "Better than I ever imagined possible." He had boarded the aircraft as someone who endured flying out of necessity. He was leaving as someone who had begun to appreciate it as a remarkable achievement of human engineering and cooperation. The panic attack that had seemed like his worst nightmare had actually opened the door to a completely new understanding of aviation, trust, and his own capacity for growth. But more than that, he had learned something valuable about facing fears with intellectual curiosity and the right guidance when navigating unfamiliar territory. Captain Rodriguez had done more than calm his immediate anxiety. He had demonstrated how expertise, combined with empathy, could transform someone's entire perspective on what had seemed like an insurmountable challenge. As David caught a taxi to his hotel, he was already thinking about the aviation safety books Captain Rodriguez had recommended. For the first time in his life, he was actually curious to learn more about flying. The engineer in him was excited to understand the systems and principles more deeply, and the human in him was grateful for the reminder that sometimes the best way to overcome fear is to replace ignorance with understanding. The business presentation that had seemed so important when he booked the flight now felt like a secondary benefit of the trip. The primary achievement had been personal, discovering that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite fear, especially when guided by people who possessed both expertise and genuine care for others' well-being. His flight experience had taught him something valuable about trust, competence, and the importance of asking the right questions when facing the unknown. These were lessons that would serve him well not just in future air travel, but in every aspect of his personal and professional life where he encountered unfamiliar challenges. As the taxi pulled away from O'Hare Airport, David looked up at the aircraft taking off and landing overhead. Instead of seeing them as harbingers of anxiety, he now saw them as evidence of human achievement. Thousands of people every day trusting in the expertise of flight crews, the integrity of engineering systems, and the coordination of complex operations that made modern aviation possible. The transformation was remarkable, but David knew it was just the beginning. He had learned that facing fears with intellectual curiosity and the right guidance could lead to not just managing anxiety, but to genuine appreciation for what had previously seemed threatening. That was a lesson worth much more than the cost of a plane ticket, and one that would continue paying dividends long after his business in Chicago was completed.
3 days later, David Chen stood in the departure lounge at Chicago O'Hare, looking out at the aircraft lined up at the gates. The sight that would have filled him with dread just a week ago now sparked something entirely different, genuine curiosity and anticipation. His presentation to the Morrison & Associates client had been a remarkable success. The sustainable design proposal he had developed for their new headquarters building had not only met their requirements, but exceeded their expectations in ways that led to an expanded contract and a promotion discussion with his firm's partners. But David knew that the real achievement of his Chicago trip had nothing to do with structural engineering. The return flight to Seattle was scheduled to depart in 45 minutes. Flight AW315, the same route in reverse, with Captain Rodriguez at the controls once again. When David had seen the pilot's name on his boarding information, he had felt a surge of gratitude and excitement about the opportunity to continue their conversation. During his 3 days in Chicago, David had purchased and read 2 of the aviation safety books that Captain Rodriguez had recommended. Understanding Flight, An Engineer's Guide to Commercial Aviation, had been particularly fascinating, providing detailed technical information about aircraft systems, maintenance procedures, and safety protocols. The more he learned, the more impressed he became with the sophistication and redundancy built into modern aviation. He had also spent time researching Captain Rodriguez's background and discovered that his reputation extended far beyond their individual interaction. The captain had been recognized multiple times for his safety record, his mentorship of younger pilots, and his involvement in developing training programs for handling passenger anxiety. David realized that his experience hadn't been unique. Captain Rodriguez regularly went above and beyond his basic duties to ensure passenger well-being. As boarding began for his return flight, David noticed his physical response was completely different from 3 days ago. His heart rate was normal, his palms were dry, and he felt the pleasant anticipation of someone looking forward to an interesting journey, rather than the dread of someone facing an ordeal. "Mr. Chen," came a familiar voice as David approached the boarding gate. Captain Rodriguez was standing near the jetway entrance, greeting passengers as they boarded. "How did your presentation go?" "Better than I could have hoped," David replied with a genuine smile. "The client approved our proposal and asked us to expand the project scope. I think the confidence I gained from our conversation contributed to my presentation skills." Captain Rodriguez looked pleased. "That's wonderful to hear. Are you ready for another flight?" "I'm actually looking forward to it," David said, and he meant it completely. "Outstanding. I have First Officer Williams with me again today, and I think you'll enjoy meeting her if you're interested in visiting the cockpit before departure." David was surprised. "Her? I thought First Officer Williams was—" "My mistake in pronoun usage during our previous flight," Captain Rodriguez said with a smile. "Sarah Williams is one of our most skilled co-pilots. She has a background in aerospace engineering before she became a pilot, so I think you'd find her perspective interesting."
Mr. Chen, I'm Sarah Williams, first officer for today's flight. Captain Rodriguez told me about your interest in aviation systems from an engineering perspective. I understand you're a structural engineer? That's right, David replied. And Captain Rodriguez mentioned that you have an aerospace engineering background? I do. I worked for 5 years designing aircraft control systems before I decided I wanted to actually fly the aircraft I was helping to design. It's been a fascinating career transition. They spent several minutes discussing the intersection of engineering disciplines in aviation. David found Sarah's perspective particularly valuable because she understood both the design principles behind aircraft systems and the practical experience of operating them in real-world conditions. "Would you like to see the cockpit before we push back?" Sarah asked. "I could show you some of the control systems we discussed." David accepted the invitation eagerly. Standing in the cockpit beside Sarah and Captain Rodriguez, he marveled at how different his perspective had become. Just days ago, the complexity of the instruments would have reinforced his sense that flying was beyond human capability to manage safely. Now, he appreciated the thoughtful engineering that made complex operations manageable and reliable. Sarah explained the flight management computer system, showing David how pilots input flight plans and how the aircraft's navigation systems ensure precise routing and altitude control. Captain Rodriguez demonstrated the weather radar system and explained how they used real-time meteorological data to avoid turbulence and ensure passenger comfort. "The level of information available to us is remarkable," Captain Rodriguez said. "We know about weather conditions, air traffic, airport conditions, and aircraft performance in real time throughout the flight. It's nothing like the early days of aviation when pilots had to rely primarily on visual navigation and limited communication." David asked technical questions about redundant systems, emergency procedures, and maintenance protocols. Each answer reinforced his understanding that commercial aviation operated with multiple layers of safety systems and highly trained professionals who took their responsibilities seriously. As he returned to his seat for departure, David realized that his transformation had gone beyond simply overcoming a fear. He had developed genuine appreciation for the technical achievement represented by commercial aviation and the professionalism of the people who made it work safely every day. The takeoff was smooth and routine, exactly as he now expected it to be. During the climb to cruising altitude, David found himself looking out the window with interest rather than anxiety, appreciating the engineering marvel of flight and the stunning views available from 37,000 feet. About an hour into the flight, Captain Rodriguez once again left the cockpit to visit with passengers. When he stopped by David's seat, he was reading one of the aviation books he had purchased in Chicago. "How are you finding the book?" the captain asked. "Fascinating. I had no idea how much research and development goes into aircraft design and testing. The certification requirements are incredibly rigorous." "More rigorous than building codes?" Captain Rodriguez asked with interest. "In many ways, yes. Buildings are designed to remain stationary and deal with predictable loads like wind and earthquakes. Aircraft have to operate safely in a much wider range of dynamic conditions while maintaining structural integrity, fuel efficiency, and passenger comfort."
They talked for nearly 30 minutes about engineering challenges in aviation, comparing aircraft design problems to the structural engineering issues David dealt with in his work. The conversation was technical but accessible, and David found himself thinking about potential career intersections between his current expertise and the aviation industry. "Captain Rodriguez," David said as their conversation began to wind down, "I want to thank you for something beyond just helping me with my fear of flying. You showed me how expertise combined with genuine caring can completely transform someone's perspective on what seemed like an insurmountable problem." "That means a great deal to me," the captain replied. "But I think you deserve most of the credit. You approached your fear with intellectual curiosity and openness to new information. Not everyone is willing to do that." "I've been thinking about that," David said. "I realize I approach technical challenges in my work the same way you helped me approach flying, by understanding the underlying principles and building confidence through knowledge. But I had never applied that same methodology to my personal fears." Captain Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Fear often makes us less rational, not more rational. But when someone can maintain their analytical abilities even while anxious, they can make remarkable progress in overcoming what seemed impossible." As the flight continued, David reflected on the broader implications of his experience. The panic attack that had seemed like a crisis actually created an opportunity for growth that he might never have discovered otherwise. More importantly, he had learned something valuable about the power of finding the right guide when facing unfamiliar challenges. The landing in Seattle was as smooth and professional as everything else about both flights. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, David felt a sense of completion that went beyond simply arriving at his destination. He had not just traveled from Chicago to Seattle, he had traveled from fear to understanding, from anxiety to appreciation. Before leaving the aircraft, David made sure to thank both Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Williams for their professionalism and patience with his questions. "Mr. Chen," Captain Rodriguez said as they shook hands, "I have a feeling this won't be your last comfortable flight. You've developed the foundation for understanding aviation that will serve you well in future travel. I hope you're right, and I hope I have the opportunity to fly with you again sometime." As David walked through Seattle-Tacoma International Airport toward the ground transportation area, he found himself looking at the departure boards with interest rather than anxiety. Cities around the world that had once seemed impossibly distant now felt accessible and inviting. His phone buzzed with a text from Mike. "How did the return flight go?" "I think I might actually enjoy flying now, and I have some ideas about potential career opportunities in aerospace engineering." Mike's response came quickly. "What happened to you in Chicago? You sound like a different person." David smiled as he typed back, "I learned that sometimes the best way to overcome a fear is to understand it thoroughly, and that finding the right teacher can make all the difference." Over the following weeks, David found that his aviation experience had influenced other areas of his life. He approached unfamiliar situations with more curiosity and less anxiety. He sought out expert guidance when facing new challenges rather than trying to figure everything out independently. Most importantly, he had gained confidence in his ability to learn and adapt when confronted with circumstances outside his comfort zone. 2 months later, when Morrison & Associates was offered a consulting contract for a new airport terminal design, David volunteered to lead the project team. His colleagues were surprised by his enthusiasm for an aviation-related project. But David knew that his recent experiences had given him both technical knowledge and personal motivation that would make him exceptionally effective in that role. The airport project was a success, and it led to additional opportunities in transportation infrastructure. Within a year, David had become the firm's leading expert on aviation facility design, a specialization that required regular travel to airports around the world. Each flight became an opportunity to observe airport operations, interact with aviation professionals, and deepen his understanding of the industry he had once feared. The transformation was so complete that colleagues who had known him during his flying-phobic days could hardly believe the change. But perhaps most importantly, David had learned a lesson about courage and growth that extended far beyond aviation. He had discovered that fear often masks opportunity, and that the willingness to face anxiety with intellectual curiosity and expert guidance can lead to achievements that once seemed impossible. The panic attack on Flight AW312 had been one of the most frightening experiences of his adult life, but it had also been the catalyst for personal and professional growth that he now considered among his most valuable life experiences. Captain Rodriguez had not just helped him become comfortable with flying, he had demonstrated the transformative power of expertise applied with genuine care for others' well-being. Years later, when David found himself in positions where he could mentor younger engineers or help colleagues overcome technical challenges, he remembered the patience and systematic approach that Captain Rodriguez had shown him. The lesson had come full circle. Knowledge shared with empathy and genuine concern for others' success could create positive changes that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The businessman who had once required medication just to board an aircraft had become someone who looked forward to every flight as an opportunity for learning and appreciation of human achievement. It was a transformation that began with a panic attack and a pilot's willingness to go beyond his job description to help a frightened passenger discover that understanding could triumph over fear.